I didn't order a widow with 3 mouths to feed. The words cracked through the crowded train platform louder than the steam engine's whistle. Every conversation stopped. Travelers turned their heads. Even the station porter froze with a crate balanced on his shoulder. A young widow stood motionless, one worn leather bag hanging from her hand while her other arm held her smallest child against her chest. Beside her stood a skinny boy of about 9 and a little girl no older than 7, both clutching each other as if they already knew what came after those cruel words. The woman's face didn't twist in anger or tears. It simply became still, the kind of stillness that only comes after life has already taken everything worth crying over. She lowered her eyes, nodded once, and quietly picked up the second bag lying beside her feet. If humiliation had a sound, it was the silence that followed. Then, just as she stepped away, the rancher who had spoken those words took one step forward and called after her, but she kept walking. Only 2 weeks earlier, Sarah Bennett had buried her husband beside a lonely wooden church outside Dry Creek. Jacob Bennett had been known as the hardest-working carpenter for 50 miles, a man whose hands could build a house that would survive generations. Then a wagon accident stole him in a single afternoon, leaving behind a wife with 3 frightened children and debts she had never known existed. Before the fresh dirt on his grave had settled, the bank claimed their small cabin. The furniture was sold. The tools were taken. Neighbors helped where they could, but kindness could not feed 4 empty stomachs forever. Then came a letter written by Jacob months before his death. It spoke of his older brother, Thomas Bennett, a ranch owner in Oakhaven whom Jacob had not seen in nearly 15 years after a bitter family argument. If anything ever happens to me, the letter read, go to Thomas. He may hate me, but he has more honor than he admits. Sarah had read that sentence 100 times before finally gathering enough courage to make the journey. She sold her wedding ring to buy train tickets and packed only what would fit into 2 weathered travel bags. Every mile toward Oakhaven carried equal amounts of hope and fear. She knew nothing about Thomas except the stories Jacob rarely shared. He was stubborn, proud, and believed weakness invited disaster. But he was family, and family was all she had left. The children had spent most of the journey asking innocent questions Sarah could barely answer. Will Uncle Thomas have horses? Little Emma asked. Will we sleep in real beds again? Samuel wondered. Tiny Noah, too young to understand death, kept asking when Papa would meet them. Sarah answered each question with a smile that hurt more every time she forced it onto her face. She could not let them see how frightened she truly was. When the train finally reached Oakhaven Station, Sarah spotted a tall, broad-shouldered man waiting near a wagon. His gray coat looked expensive but dusty from work. His beard carried streaks of silver, and his sharp blue eyes studied every passenger stepping onto the platform. She knew immediately it had to be Thomas Bennett. There was something unmistakably familiar about the shape of his face. It reminded her painfully of Jacob. She approached carefully, holding Noah tighter against her shoulder. Mr. Bennett, she asked softly. The man turned. I'm Sarah. Jacob's wife. For one brief second something flickered across his face. Surprise. Perhaps even grief. But it disappeared almost instantly behind a wall of cold restraint. So, he muttered. He finally found a reason to send for me. Sarah swallowed. Jacob passed away. Thomas stared at her without speaking. He died 2 weeks ago. His jaw tightened. I found his letter. She handed it to him. Thomas unfolded the paper slowly, recognizing his younger brother's handwriting immediately. His eyes moved across every line until they stopped near the end. He folded the letter again with careful precision and slipped it into his coat pocket. I came because I had nowhere else to go. Thomas looked past her toward the children. Samuel stood as straight as he could, trying to look older than he was. Emma hid behind her brother. Noah rested his head on Sarah's shoulder, half asleep. Thomas let out a slow breath before saying the sentence that everyone nearby would remember. I didn't order a widow with 3 mouths to feed. The word struck harder than any slap. Sarah felt every eye on the platform staring at her. She wanted to explain. She wanted to tell him she had fought until there was nowhere left to fight. Instead she simply nodded. I understand. She bent down, lifted the heavier travel bag despite her trembling hands, adjusted Noah against her shoulder, and motioned for Samuel and Emma to follow. Neither child complained. Neither asked where they were going. They had learned too quickly that adults often had no answers. Sarah walked with quiet dignity toward the station exit, refusing to let anyone see tears in her eyes. Around them whispers spread through the crowd. What kind of man sends away his own brother's family? Those poor children. Thomas heard every word. He ignored them. Or at least he tried to. His fingers tightened around the folded letter inside his pocket until the paper nearly crumpled. His eyes followed Sarah as she struggled with the heavy bag. Samuel suddenly grabbed one handle to help his mother. The little boy nearly fell from the weight, but he refused to let go. Thomas noticed. Then Emma quietly removed her own worn shawl and wrapped it around sleeping Noah because the blanket had slipped from his shoulders. Thomas noticed that too. No one had spoken another word. Sarah reached the wooden steps leading away from the station platform. She placed one careful foot down while balancing Noah and the luggage. The second bag slipped from her grasp. It crashed onto the boards, spilling a few folded clothes, a cracked family photograph, and one small wooden toy horse carved by Jacob years ago. Samuel hurried to gather everything before strangers stepped on it. Emma picked up the photograph with both hands as though it were made of glass. Sarah knelt to help them, her face burning with embarrassment. Thomas stood frozen. His eyes settled on the toy horse. He recognized it instantly. He had carved the very first one exactly like it for Jacob when they were boys. Jacob had copied the design years later for his own son. A memory he had buried for 15 years came rushing back without warning. For the first time since Sarah arrived, the hard expression on Thomas Bennett's face began to crack. And before she disappeared beyond the station gate forever, he took one step forward. Sarah. Thomas's voice echoed across the station platform just before she reached the gate. She stopped, but she didn't turn around immediately. She had heard enough false hope in the last 2 weeks to know that sometimes people only called you back to make the humiliation last a little longer. Samuel looked at his mother, waiting for her decision. Emma clutched the framed photograph against her chest while little Noah slept peacefully, unaware that his family's future balanced on a single moment. After a long silence, Sarah slowly turned. Thomas stood exactly where she had left him, one hand still inside his coat pocket, holding Jacob's letter. His stern face had changed. The pride was still there, but something heavier rested behind his eyes now, regret. I was wrong, he said quietly. No one on the platform spoke. Thomas walked toward them until only a few feet separated them. I spent 15 years blaming my brother for choices neither of us can change. When I saw you standing here, all I could think about was the burden. I forgot you were carrying one long before you reached my station. Sarah remained silent. I can't change what I said. No, she answered calmly. You can't. I know. Another long silence passed. Finally Thomas looked at the children. What are your names? The boy answered first. I'm Samuel. The little girl whispered, Emma. Thomas smiled gently at the sleeping toddler. And this little fellow? Noah. Thomas nodded slowly. He looks like Jacob. Sarah felt tears threatening again but refused to let them fall. Thomas bent down, picked up the heavy travel bag himself, then carefully handed Emma the family photograph she had almost dropped. You shouldn't be standing on this platform. Sarah frowned. I already told you, we'll leave. I didn't say leave. She stared at him. I said, you shouldn't be standing here. For the first time since arriving in Oakhaven, Sarah saw genuine shame on his face. My ranch is 20 miles from here. She didn't answer. There are empty rooms. Still nothing. The children deserve a roof. Samuel looked hopefully toward his mother. Emma squeezed her mother's hand. Sarah's voice remained cautious. What happens when you decide tomorrow that we're still too much to feed? Thomas lowered his head. You'll have my word. My husband trusted your word. The sentence struck harder than any accusation. Thomas closed his eyes briefly. I failed him while he was alive. He looked directly at Sarah. I won't fail his children. Sarah searched his face for any sign of pity. She found none. Only remorse. After everything she had endured, that mattered. Without another word she gave a small nod. Thomas carried both travel bags to the wagon waiting outside. The ride to Bennett Ranch was quiet. The children watched endless fields stretching toward distant hills while Sarah sat stiffly, unsure whether she had made the right decision. Thomas finally broke the silence. Jacob loved carving wood. Sarah looked surprised. He never stopped. Thomas smiled faintly. When we were boys, we'd race to finish wooden horses before supper. He always cheated. Sarah laughed softly before she could stop herself. It sounds exactly like him. For the first time in years, Thomas laughed too. When the ranch finally appeared, the children couldn't hide their amazement. Large barns stood beside wide horse pastures. Workers moved cattle while smoke rose from the ranch house chimney. Emma whispered, "It's beautiful." Thomas helped Sarah down from the wagon. The ranch hands gathered nearby, confused by the unexpected guests. Thomas faced them without hesitation. "This is Sarah Bennett." He placed a hand gently on Samuel's shoulder. "My brother's family." No one questioned him. No one dared. Inside the house, Sarah expected luxury. Instead she found something much different. Everything was clean but simple. The walls carried old family photographs. One picture showed two teenage brothers standing beside unfinished fence posts. Jacob and Thomas, smiling. Sarah realized they had once loved each other deeply before pride destroyed years they could never recover. That evening the children ate until they could barely move. Fresh bread, stew, warm milk. Emma quietly asked permission before taking a second piece of bread. Thomas noticed. "You don't have to ask." She looked uncertain. He smiled. "There will be enough tomorrow too." Those words meant more than the meal itself. Later that night Sarah found Thomas sitting alone on the porch holding Jacob's letter. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. She sat beside him. Neither spoke for several minutes. Finally Thomas unfolded the letter again. "There was one sentence I never read aloud." Sarah looked toward him. He cleared his throat. "Thomas, if you're reading this, don't punish my family for mistakes that belong to me and you. Give my children the uncle I always believed you could become." Thomas's voice broke. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Sarah answered gently. "Maybe not." He nodded. "But children don't need perfect people." She looked toward the window where Samuel and Emma had already fallen asleep beside Noah. "They need someone who stays." Thomas quietly wiped his eyes. "I can do that." The next morning he proved it. He gave Samuel a small set of carving tools that had once belonged to Jacob. He helped Emma choose her own pony. He carried Noah across the yard on his shoulders while the little boy laughed louder than anyone had heard since his father's death. The ranch slowly changed. Not because Sarah demanded anything, but because kindness spread through it. She organized the kitchen, helped injured workers, taught the ranch children to read during evenings, and filled the empty house with laughter it had not known for years. Months passed. The loneliness that had haunted every room slowly disappeared. One afternoon Thomas stood watching Samuel carefully carve a tiny wooden horse. The design was familiar. Exactly like the one that had fallen from Sarah's bag at the station. Samuel smiled proudly. "Dad taught me." Thomas swallowed hard. "He taught me first." Samuel handed him the unfinished carving. "Can you help me finish it?" Thomas accepted the knife. Together they shaped the little horse exactly as two brothers once had decades earlier. Sarah watched from the porch. She finally understood why Jacob had written that letter. He hadn't been sending his family to a wealthy ranch. He had been sending two broken families toward the only place where they could heal each other. Thomas never forgot the cruel words he had spoken at the station. Neither did Sarah. But instead of becoming the sentence that destroyed a family, they became the sentence that changed a man's heart forever. And years later, whenever anyone asked Samuel where he had learned to carve such beautiful wooden horses, he always gave the same answer with a smile. "My father taught me how to begin. My uncle taught me how to finish."